constantly says that in 1,000 ways. One of the things I want you to notice as you read Isaiah is that the primary imagery for Zion, not in terms of city or mountain, but in terms of metaphor, is Zion is constantly described as a woman. Zion is a feminine figure in the Old Testament, and especially in Isaiah. And when Zion is being described, Zion shows up in all three sections, all three stories, all three stages of history. When Zion is described here, and you probably all know this imagery, it often makes us uncomfortable today. Here, Zion is a faithless whore. She's a prostitute who's cheating on her husband. Here, she is a barren mother whose children have been taken away from her, and whose husband has left her, and who is just on her own abandoned. And she's an incredibly sympathetic figure here. And here, she's like a bride who's become a virgin all over again, and is clothed in beauty, and whose children have come back to her. So she's this feminine figure who is described in slightly different but continuous ways in these three sections. Here's a section of the New Testament that, even though it's in a well-known book, Galatians, we often don't know. Paul says in Galatians 4 that present-day Jerusalem, which Paul sees as symbolic of like non-Christian Judaism, those who try to find salvation in their identity in the law rather than in Jesus. Paul says in Galatians 4, the present Jerusalem is in chains and enslaved, but the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. John Calvin used to like to say, and I love this, most Protestants usually think this is a Catholic thing to say, but it's just such a Christian thing to say. Calvin used to love to say, no one has the right to call God his father who does not call the church his mother. Zion is not Brendan Price or Corinne. Zion is the church. Zion is us, and Zion is our mother, just as God is our father. And during the exile, Zion is still back in Jerusalem, but she's been abandoned by her children. Her children have been stolen from her, and she's a barren mother who's desolate. And Paul quotes that in Galatians 4, Isaiah 54. He says, rejoice, O barren one, because your children will soon be more than the woman who has children right now. That a reversal is coming in the future. So Zion is the main theme of Isaiah, and in the weeks to come, and I hope, Lord willing, that in the final session at the very end of the summer, we're going to come back and revisit this in light of everything we've done over the next 2.5 months, whatever, and fill this in more. But it raises the question for now, why is Zion so central in Isaiah? And without defending this at all, I want to give you, and this will lead into our second point, which we'll end with, I want to give you what I think is the reason that Zion is the obsession of Isaiah and the obsession of the Old Testament. There is an assumption underneath Isaiah and underneath the Old Testament that rarely is verbalized in its fullness explicitly, but which is hinted at 1,000 times. And when you connect the dots, you see it, which is this. I think the assumption is this. Here's the principle I would say is underneath all 66 chapters of Isaiah. As goes Zion, so go God's purposes for the universe. If what is supposed to be happening here is not happening here, what is supposed to be happening everywhere else is not happening. If this is what it's supposed to be, then everywhere else has hope too. Let me point out something. What's the theme structurally of Isaiah 1 through 39? Zion is not the way it's supposed to be. Therefore, bad news for the nations. Therefore, bad news for the universe. That's the structure of 1st Isaiah. When you read Isaiah 40 to 55, we didn't get into this tonight. What's the main theme of Isaiah 40 to 55? And I'll tell it to you for now. New Exodus. Just as Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt, so someone is coming, the servant of the Lord, who's going to bring about a greater exodus. And the people of Israel are going to return from the north and the south and the east and the west and come back to the land. Salvation for Israel. What's the main theme of 3rd Isaiah? Behold, chapter 65, I saw new heavens and a new earth. New exodus for Israel leads to new creation for everyone. Notice the structure of Isaiah. When Zion goes bad, everything else is bad news for the nations and the universe. When Zion finally becomes what it should be, the rest of the universe has hope. The theme of Isaiah is that God's purposes for the nations and even for the whole created order start and ultimately end here. If this is on track, everything God wants to accomplish in creation is on track. If this is faithless, everyone else is hopeless. And therefore, Zion is supposed to be the light to the world, a city set on a hill, and the well-being and the future of the nations and the world hangs on what happens here. Which is why Jesus is so obsessed with the 12 and his followers. It's not because he doesn't love the rest of the world. It's the reason that God is so obsessed with Jonah isn't because God is so obsessed with Jonah. It's because Nineveh has no hope if Jonah doesn't get on track. And the rest of the Gentiles have no hope if Jesus' followers don't get on track. Zion is the center of everything in Isaiah. Okay, and then finally, and I will definitely come back to this later this summer, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do it from time to time throughout. I want you to notice something that I've only progressively noticed over time. It has taken me a long time to see it, and I'm still seeing it in more fullness and clarity all the time. If Zion is what creation's destiny hangs on, this is especially true in Isaiah 40 to 66, but it is true of the whole book. But there are two creation stories that run neck and neck throughout Isaiah. And if you can bear with me for maybe 2 or 3 more minutes, I just want to show it to you. Turn to Isaiah 41. And this is on the handout, and I'll show you as we end here in 2 or 3 minutes where it is that you can start looking at it. One creation story has Yahweh at the center, the other has the nations at the center. In Yahweh's creation story, it's not about Adam and Eve, but about Israel, and the nation's creation story is about their idols that they try to make. Now, if you don't know this, not only in Hebrew but also in Greek, the word for idol is also, and this is very significant, the same word for, and sometimes you even see it in English translations, idols are also graven images. The word for idols is also the word for images, which is the word in Genesis 1 for what we're supposed to be. And there is all kinds of plays on this theme. And in chapter 41, notice this, and let this be something that launches you into looking at the book in a new way. In chapter 41, and you'll see in 40 to 55 especially, but really the whole book, Isaiah is obsessed with why the nations try to make idols and mocks it constantly, but also compares it constantly to what Yahweh is trying to do through Israel. And notice in chapter 41, all of the potter and clay imagery is about this story, by the way. Notice in chapter 41, it says, in verse 7, the craftsman who's making an idol, this pagan Gentile, he strengthens the goldsmith, and he who smooths with the hammer, him who strikes the anvil, and he says of the soldering, what he makes, it is good. Which you should recognize as showing up earlier in the story. When the nations make their idols, their images, which reflect something which is otherwise invisible, what do they declare over it? It is good. When God made his idol, his image, at the beginning of history, us, he said, it is good. Okay, chapter 51. We'll look at 2 more passages. Chapter 51 says this. In the future, verse 3, the Lord will comfort Zion. He comforts all her waste places, and he makes her wilderness like Eden and her desert like the garden of the Lord. You know what Israel/Zion is supposed to be in the future? Eden. The center of creation, the way it's supposed to be. Okay, final one, chapter 44. And there are so many connections here once you start noticing it. Chapter 44. Actually, go back to 41 real quick. Just to point this out. I started our time tonight by reading that great Luther quote. When I read Isaiah, it just looks like he's schizophrenic and his attention is scattered, and he says this, and then he says that, and then he says that, and it seems like there's no rhyme and reason. Whenever you suspect that, you should suspect rightly you're reading Isaiah wrongly. Isaiah always has reasons that he moves from one thing to another. And in Isaiah 40 to 55 especially, but throughout the book, what you will see is Isaiah will spend tons of time talking about this and these guys' relationship to him, and then all of a sudden we'll turn here and talk about their relationships to these. And that is never random. These two stories are polemically related to each other. What Yahweh is trying to accomplish to Israel is what the Gentile nations are trying to accomplish to their idols. And so there are two stories in which you could say God's original purposes in creation, someone is trying to reenact those. Yahweh is trying to reenact what he was trying to do through us, through Israel, and the nations are trying to reenact the creation story through idols. One is a parody of the real thing and futile and destined to fail, and this one is the genuine article. And this is the key to the book of Isaiah, that these two recreation stories, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and one of the things you'll see, we'll talk about when we get there in a month or so, in Isaiah 40 to 55, one of the main images is that there's a cosmic trial going on. There's a lawsuit. There's a case in a courtroom before the universe, and the contestants are Yahweh and the nations. And through what they make in their image, Israel and the idols, the question before the world is, who is the true God? And how will he accomplish his purposes? And the book of Isaiah is about which one of these stories is going to be vindicated at the end of history. Okay, chapter 44, final one. Notice this. Verses 1 through 8, all about Israel and Jacob, God's servant that he has chosen and is supposed to be righteous and filled with justice, just like Yahweh is. Then all of a sudden, you can see it's even set apart differently as prose. Verses 9 through 20 is about the futility of these guys who try to make these things. And their images, and they're futile. And then right afterwards, verse 21, it returns to this story. And it's on the handout under, let me just point it out so you guys know where it is. But on page 4 and 5, I list, right under the Zion theme on significant motifs, the theme of creation. And this isn't even exhaustive, but it's a pretty good start. I list all kinds of parallels that if you notice this, it will clarify your vision enormously. That the same way this story is described, the same vocabulary and images and themes is the way this story is told. It's like you're hearing the same story, even though there are two stories, and this is the key. So for instance, the nations often say, like the king of Babylon, I am, and there is no one beside me. And Yahweh is often saying, I am, and there is no one beside me. One day, well, not one day, but in the present, the nations make their idols, and they bow down before them. Yahweh makes Israel in the Exodus and forms Israel and fashions Israel. Same verbs that are used for what the nations do to their idols. And one day the nation will come and bow down to Israel. So, even though there's a sense in which it's Yahweh versus the nations and Israel versus idols, this will be the final thing I say, there's also a sense in which the direction is always this. Yahweh has a contest against the idols because that's where the nations are setting their hope, and the nations are constantly oppressing Israel. And the reason these stories are going on is because this is a cosmic war between what does the future of the human race really hold, which creation story is going to be vindicated. And the final real chapter of Isaiah, because 66 is the conclusion, chapter 65, this is where Revelation picks it up. It says, behold, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And at the center of it is Israel, Zion, Jerusalem, the way it's supposed to be. And so we're going to see God is trying to bring about his original purposes in creation through Israel, through Zion, and therefore everything hangs on what happens to this group of people. And we already said, let's end here, that when Isaiah ends in 56 to 66, Zion's been rebuilt, the temple's there, but everybody's like, this is as good as it gets. Like, God's presence hasn't refilled the temple. We're not different than the nations around us. We're still largely heart of heart. This is the context in which Jesus shows up and grabs followers, disciples, and says, you are a city set on a mountain. You are the light to the Gentiles. You are the hope of the world in the future. because this never happens within the confines of Isaiah's history itself. We are still waiting for the fulfillment of this when we get to the end of Isaiah, and it's not just, if there is one practical implication that I hope we get by the end of the semester, it is reductionistic to the extreme to say Isaiah predicted Jesus. Not just because Isaiah doesn't really predict Jesus, but sets patterns written, but also because the book of Isaiah is not about the story of Jesus, period. The book of Isaiah is about the story of Jesus and his church. The future of the world hangs on the church, not just what Jesus did. Jesus is the servant of the Lord who gets Israel back on track, but we're Zion, and Zion needs to be faithful. If the nations are going to stream to Zion, and if the universe as a whole is going to be recreated. And so again, the obsession of Isaiah is Zion's destiny. Because the destiny of the universe starts and ends here. So notice this. Look for it as you read Isaiah. Thoughts, questions? We could say so much more. Would encourage you to keep this handout before you as we read Isaiah, and especially the creation stories. Look these verses up and start noticing how profound and pervasive the parallelism is. It will just open up all kinds of new vistas and avenues for you as you read Isaiah. Does that make sense? Good. Thoughts, questions, Micah? And if you need to take off, feel free to take off.
I was going to say there, if you find a good audio version of Isaiah, it's like under 4 hours. So
Oh yeah?
maybe I'll.
Yeah, I know that like the ESV website will let you listen to the Bible for free. Hey Teal, can I grab you for a second?
Yes.
Yeah. So the ESV Bible website will let you listen to it for free, and I'm sure there are other. But one of the reasons I like the ESV one, I do like the translation of the ESV in general, but the ESV one online, they actually hired this really cool professional actor who's got kind of like a British accent, which just makes everything sound better, and he narrates the whole Bible. So if you go online and you look up Isaiah on the ESV website, there's always like a link or like something you can click for the audio, and you can listen to the whole thing for free there. So yeah, listening to Isaiah is definitely a different experience than reading Isaiah. Good. Other thoughts, other questions? David?
Sorry, really quickly, it was just a simple question.
Yeah.
When does this go until? In
It
terms
will
of
go
weeks?
at least until the final week in July, potentially the first week in August, we'll have our last meeting. Yeah, so we'll let you guys know. If we do it in the first week of August, which I hope we do, we'll have finished all 66 chapters, and we'll kind of like revisit this meta stuff in light of having actually looked at the details along the way, so I hope we can do that. Yeah.
What do we focus on next week?
Teal will take you through potentially one, but especially chapters 2 through 12. So I do encourage you guys, try to read the whole book in a sitting or two this week, but if you get extra time, especially focus on these chapters, which are about judgment on Zion, Judah and Jerusalem. Yeah, and we'll send all this stuff out. The handout will go out by email, and the outline of what we're studying week by week. If that hasn't gone out already, we'll send that out in the next couple of days. Well, thank you guys.